The judge looked down at me over her glasses and asked if I was ready to proceed. I said yes. I was representing myself. My aunt, the woman sitting at the plaintiff's table with a lawyer who billed $400 an hour, actually laughed. Not a real laugh. The kind people make when they want you to know they think you're stupid. She leaned over and said something to her attorney, and he smiled too, and I stood there at that oak table with my folder of documents and my highlighted copy of Oregon probate law, and I thought, go ahead, I'll come back to that day, but you need to understand how I got there first. I was 16 years old the summer my parents told me they were done. Not done with each other, done with me. My mum had remarried 2 years before. A man named Ray who had 2 kids of his own and a house in Bend that wasn't big enough for everyone, which is what she told me when she explained that I'd be staying with my dad. My dad, by that point, was living in a studio apartment in Portland and working night shifts at a distribution warehouse. He picked me up from my mum's house with a duffel bag in his back seat and a look on his face like he was doing me a favor by showing up at all. That lasted 4 months. In February, he told me things were tight, that I was old enough to figure something out, that he'd give me a week to make arrangements. I was 16. I didn't know what arrangements meant for a 16-year-old with $40 in a bank account and a backpack. I called my mum. She said she was sorry, but Ray's kids needed the room. I called my grandmother, who was 73 and lived alone in a 2-bedroom house in Eugene, and she said, come. I came. Her name was Ruth Ann. She was my dad's mother, which meant she had no real obligation to me once her son decided I wasn't his problem anymore. She knew that. I think she wanted me to know she knew that, not to hold it over me, but because she wanted it to be clear that she chose this. She had driven 2 hours to meet my dad in a parking lot off the highway, and she put my bags in her trunk, and she didn't say a word about him the whole drive back. She turned on a country radio station and asked if I was hungry, and when I said not really, she said we'd stop anyway because she ordered a slice of lemon meringue pie and a cup of coffee, and she slid half the pie across the table to me without asking. That was the beginning. Her house smelled like cedar and old books. She had a vegetable garden in the backyard she'd kept up for 30 years, and a cat named something I can never remember correctly, something old-fashioned, some woman's name, who slept on the heating vent in the hallway. She had a quilt on every bed and strong opinions about what counted as a real meal, and she woke up every morning at 5:30 without an alarm. She taught me things, not in a formal way. She just lived her life and let me be part of it, and in being part of it, I learned how to do a lot of things I didn't know. How to make a grocery budget stretch, how to read a lease before you sign it, how to talk to a doctor like they work for you, not the other way around. How to change a tire and balance a checkbook, and what to do when someone is bluffing. That last one she learned from 40 years of playing poker with her church friends, and she passed it on with complete seriousness. I finished high school in Eugene. I worked at a bakery on weekends and saved money. My grandmother made me open a Roth IRA at 18. She found the brochure herself and mailed it to me with a sticky note that said, "Start now, thank me," at 65. And I put $40 a month in it because that's all I had, and she said that was exactly right. I got a partial scholarship to University of Oregon. My grandmother drove me to campus on move-in day and helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs. And when I hugged her goodbye, she held on a beat longer than usual, and then stepped back and said, "You know what you're doing." I didn't, really, but she said it like it was already true, and that made a difference. We talked every Sunday, through my undergraduate years, through the job I got after at a non-profit in Portland doing housing advocacy work, through the apartment I furnished slowly with things from estate sales because I liked the idea of objects that had already survived something. She told me about her garden and her church friends and her opinions on whatever was in the news, which were extensive and well-sourced. I told her about the cases I worked on, the families I tried to help find stable housing, the bureaucratic walls that made me want to scream some days. She listened. She always had something useful to say. She was 81 when she got the diagnosis, congestive heart failure. Not immediately life-threatening, her cardiologist said, but a condition that would need to be managed carefully. She called me on a Sunday like usual and told me herself, matter-of-factly, the way she told me everything. Then she said she needed to talk to me about some things while she still felt well enough to talk clearly. And I drove down to Eugene that weekend and we sat at her kitchen table for most of Saturday. She told me she'd updated her will 2 years prior. She had a financial advisor, a woman named something with a lot of consonants that I always had to ask her to spell, and between the two of them they'd sorted out her estate plan. The house, the investment accounts, some savings bonds she'd held for decades. She went through it item by item like she was going over a grocery list. She left nearly everything to me. I didn't know what to say. She looked at me and said, "You're the one who showed up. That's how it works." Her estate, when she passed away 14 months later, was valued at just over $2.3 million. Most of that was the house, which had appreciated substantially over 30 years in a neighborhood that had quietly become desirable, plus the investment accounts she'd contributed to with the discipline of someone who had lived through things that made her take the future seriously. She passed on a Tuesday in March, quietly, at home the way she wanted. I flew down that afternoon. I sat with her for a while before the funeral home came. The cat was on the bed. I will not spend much time on the grief, because it is still too close, and because she would have found extended mourning impractical. What I will say is that the lemon meringue pie at every diner I've been to since then is never as good, and I've tried a lot of them. My father called me 3 days after the obituary ran. I hadn't spoken to him in 6 years, not since a conversation that went badly enough that I decided some relationships are worth closing like a door, firmly, and leaving closed. I didn't recognize the number. I answered because I was in the middle of sorting through my grandmother's papers and I was distracted. He said, "I heard about Mom." I said yes. He said he was sorry for my loss, and something about the way he said it, like it was a script he'd rehearsed, made me understand immediately that this was not a call about grief. He'd talked to a lawyer, he said, about the estate. He wanted me to know that as her son, he believed he had a legal interest in how things had been handled, that there were questions about whether my grandmother had been, quote, unduly influenced in her estate planning decisions. I sat down on the kitchen floor, which is not something I'd planned to do, but my legs made the choice before I did. "She was 81 and sharp as anyone I've ever met," I said. He said he understood that was my perspective. I hung up. My aunt, my dad's younger sister, who had barely spoken to my grandmother in a decade over some argument about their mother's furniture that I only knew about in pieces, called the following week. She was warmer about it, which was somehow worse. She said she hoped we could work something out like family. She said the estate was larger than she'd realized. She said she'd always been fond of me. I said thank you for calling and did not say anything else. 2 weeks later, I received notice that my father and my aunt were jointly contesting the will. The legal theory was undue influence, that I had manipulated an elderly woman into changing her estate plan in my favor. The argument was, essentially, that by living in her house and caring for her and being present in her life, I had exerted improper control over her decisions, that the will did not reflect her true wishes. The irony of being accused of too much presence by two people who had been almost entirely absent did not escape me. I talked to 3 estate attorneys. The consensus was that the case was weak. Oregon courts take a high bar to undue influence claims, especially when the person in question had an established documented relationship with an independent financial advisor, had updated the will 2 years before any serious health decline, and had no demonstrated vulnerability to manipulation. One attorney told me he didn't think any reputable plaintiff's lawyer would take this case on a contingency basis. She was right about the law. She was wrong about my family's willingness to pay someone to try anyway. The filing came in May. My father and my aunt were seeking to have the will invalidated and the estate distributed according to Oregon's intestate succession laws, which would have given my father, as the son, the primary share, with a portion to my aunt under certain conditions. I read the filing 3 times. I took notes. Then I did something that surprised even me. I decided to represent myself. Not because I couldn't afford an attorney, I had the funds, ironically. But because I had spent 6 years doing housing advocacy work, which meant I had spent 6 years reading legal documents, attending hearings, learning how systems work and where their pressure points are, and because something in me needed to stand in that courtroom as myself, not behind someone else's words, and face them directly, I spent 4 months preparing. I read every undue influence case I could find in Oregon case law going back 15 years. I requested my grandmother's full medical records. I contacted her financial advisor, who agreed to provide a declaration. I found her primary care physician, who had documented her cognitive sharpness in detail at every visit. I pulled her email correspondence. She had learned to email late in life and taken to it enthusiastically, and found dozens of messages discussing her estate decisions in her own words, unprompted, months before she passed. She had written in one email to her advisor, "I want Lee to have the house. She's the one who came. I've thought about it carefully and I'm not changing my mind." Lee? That's me. My full name is Lee Annette Okonkwo. My mother is Nigerian American and my grandmother never once stumbled over my last name, which I always thought said something about her. I brought that email to court. The hearing was in September. My father sat on one side of the room and didn't look at me. My aunt sat next to her attorney and looked at me a lot with an expression I can only describe as calculated concern, the kind that's designed to appear maternal but has no warmth in it. When the judge asked if I was ready to proceed and I said I was representing myself, my aunt laughed. I noted that. I noted the attorney's smile. I filed both of them away in the same place I'd been filing things since I was 16 years old, standing in a parking lot watching my dad drive away. The plaintiff's attorney opened with the narrative of an isolated elderly woman, living alone, dependent on a granddaughter who had inserted herself into her life at a vulnerable time. He used the word inserted 3 times. He emphasized the age gap, the dependency, the change from what he described as the estate's natural distribution. When it was my turn, I started with the email. I didn't read the whole thing. I just read that one sentence. She's the one who came. I've thought about it carefully and I'm not changing my mind. Then I walked through the timeline. The financial advisor's declaration, which established that my grandmother had initiated the estate planning process herself 2 years before any cardiac diagnosis, with no input from me. The physician's documentation of her cognitive status at every annual visit through the year before her death. Consistent, clear, no flags. The email chain between my grandmother and her advisor spanning 3 years, none of which included me. Then I asked the plaintiff's attorney a question that I had prepared and that I had, I'll admit, practiced in my bathroom mirror several times. I said, "You've characterized my presence in my grandmother's life as insertion. I'd like to ask you to clarify. In your theory of this case, at what point does a family member's presence become improper? Is it when they call every Sunday? Is it when they drive 2 hours to help carry boxes? Is it when they sit at a kitchen table and learn how to read a lease?" Because I did all of those things, counselor, and I'd like to understand which one you believe constitutes undue influence. He objected. The judge sustained it, but the question was already in the room. The judge did not take long. She found no evidence of undue influence. She cited the documented independence of my grandmother's decision-making, the length and consistency of our relationship, the absence of any credible testimony establishing manipulation or dependency, and the clear contemporaneous written record of my grandmother's intentions in her own words. She also noted, with what I thought was a very precise choice of language, that the plaintiffs had presented no evidence of a prior close relationship with the decedent, which undermined any claim that the distribution was inconsistent with her established values. My father left before I finished gathering my documents. My aunt stopped by my table on her way out. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about my grandmother's kitchen table, the lemon pie, the sticky note about the Roth IRA. I thought about the Sunday calls in the garden and the quilt on the bed in the room that became mine. I said, she made her wishes very clear. I think we should both respect them. She left. I stood in the courthouse parking lot for a while after that. It was one of those September days in Oregon where the light goes gold in the afternoon and everything looks slightly unreal, like a photograph of itself. I called my best friend, who had heard every chapter of this story for the past 6 months. And when she picked up, I didn't say anything for a second. She said, "Well," I said, "we won." She screamed loud enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear, and for the first time since March I laughed. A real one, the kind that surprises you. My grandmother's house still smells like cedar. I moved in last November, which felt like the right thing to do, and I've been putting things where they make sense rather than where they were before. Some things I haven't moved at all. The quilt is still on the bed in what is now my room. The cat, her name was Edith. I finally looked it up in some papers I found. Edith is gone, obviously, but I've been thinking about getting another one. The vegetable garden made it through one more season on whatever she'd left in the soil. This spring I'm starting it from scratch. I bought seeds last month, tomatoes, green beans, zucchini. She always said produced more than any one person needed, but grew anyway because waste was not the point. The point, she told me once, was the practice of it. With part of the estate, I set up a scholarship fund at the community college in Eugene. 2 awards a year for students who have experienced housing instability, which felt like the most honest use of the money I could think of. I named it after her, the Ruth Ann Okonkwo Forward Fund, which takes her name and my name and puts them together, the way things at last actually work, not by replacement, but by continuation. I still open a diner menu to the dessert section first. I still look for lemon meringue. I haven't found one that's right yet. But I keep trying, because she taught me that some things you look for, not because you expect to find them exactly as they were, but because the looking is how you stay connected to what mattered. That seems right to me. More right, anyway, than anything my father said in that parking lot in February 16 years ago when he handed me a duffel bag and called it a plan. The difference between the two of them, between him and her, was not money or house or what they left behind. It was simpler than that. She showed up. She kept showing up. And when I stood in that courtroom with my folder and my highlighted statutes and my grandmother's words on a printed email, I was just doing what she taught me. You show up, you stay. That's how it works. I think about cause and effect a lot now, not in a mystical way, just in the plain, observable way that certain choices compound over time. The way Ruth Ann's $40 a month in a retirement account compounded, quietly and without drama, into something real. My father made a choice in a parking lot in February. My mother made a choice when she decided Ray's kids needed the room. Those weren't single moments. They were the end of a long series of smaller choices, each one moving slightly away from me until the distance became permanent. I don't think they were evil people. I think they were people who, when it got hard, consistently chose the easier thing. And the easier thing, over 16 years, added up to a daughter standing alone with a backpack. Ruth Ann made different choices. She drove 2 hours. She ordered the pie. She mailed the brochure. None of those things were dramatic. None of them cost her much individually. But they were consistent, and consistency over time is its own kind of force. By the time she passed, the architecture of who I am had been built largely inside her house, at her kitchen table in the garden she kept for 30 years because the practice of it mattered. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Character isn't announced. It accumulates. Ruth Ann never told me to be honest, or to work hard, or to stand up for myself. She just did all of those things repeatedly in front of me, and I absorbed them the way you absorb anything you're close to long enough. When my father called after the obituary ran, I wasn't surprised. I was sad, and then I wasn't, because sadness requires some residual hope, and I had already done that work years earlier. What I felt instead was a kind of clarity. I knew what I had. I knew what I could prove. I knew the difference between a strong legal position and a weak one, because I had spent 6 years learning how systems work. not because I was naturally clever, but because Ruth Ann had taught me that understanding the rules of a room is how you survive the room, is how you survive the room. That's what I brought to that courthouse in September. Not rage, not a desire to punish anyone, just preparation. I had read the case law, I had organized the documents, I had my grandmother's words, in her own handwriting, in her own emails, unprompted and undeniable. I had done the work, and the work held. I think that's what people sometimes miss about stories like mine. They want the victory to be about the villain losing, but the villain losing was almost beside the point. The point was that I had become someone who could walk into that room alone and be ready. That didn't happen because of talent. It happened because of every Sunday phone call, every garden row, every sticky note on every brochure. You become what you practice. The people who raised you, biologically or otherwise, are handing you a set of habits, whether they mean to or not. Ruth Ann handed me discipline and curiosity, and the specific kind of stubbornness that doesn't collapse under pressure. My father handed me the knowledge that I could not afford to wait for someone else to show up. Both of those turned out to be useful. The scholarship fund has its first 2 recipients this fall. They're both under 25. They both moved at least twice in the last 3 years. I don't know their full stories, but I know enough to know that someone deciding they're worth the investment will matter to them in ways that don't show up immediately. That's how it works. You show up, you stay, the rest compounds.